Of course. Ms Farage, do you think there is a particular problem with Labour and anti-Semitism?
Yes, I do, and I think there was they had the big report that Shami Chakrabarti did a few years ago, and I think kind of a blind eye's been turned to this. I think there's a problem with anti-Semitism, not just in the Labour Party, by the way. I think there is a whole narrative around the Israel-Palestine conflict, where perhaps people's loyalties towards the Palestinian side have been allowed. They've been allowed to say things, perhaps way ahead of what should have been allowed.
There are, of course, other forms of racism around, as you know very well. Yours, Brexit, is a nationalist party, if I can put it that way.
Well, a nationalist party. Yeah, okay. Absolutely.
So what are you doing to ensure that you don't get racist elements joining up?
Well, as you may remember in UKIP, I forbade anybody who'd been a member of extreme organisations like the BNP from even being members of UKIP, and I'm doing exactly the same thing with the Brexit Party. We will be, as a party, we will be deeply intolerant on intolerance.
We talk of it as a party. It's not a party, though, is it? It's a business.
It just won a national election. And the fact that it operates itself you know, through a limited
but I'm saying
company,
you don't have a membership in that.
We have registered supporters. You know, we run it, you're quite right, we have a board of directors, that's where our decisions get made. We're still very young, by the way, we're just 6 months old, and we have registered supporters, and we've got about 150,000 of those who've paid their 25 quid. It's pretty much like being a member.
And you do vet members in the same way?
We vet, what we do vet are candidates, and with members, we're doing what we can to vet them, absolutely.
Because, I mean, you know, we've seen things like... though it was withdrawn, you know, your friends at Leave EU putting out that we don't want to be ordered around by a crowd.
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't think that's racist. I think it's ridiculous to use language like that. I think it may be just a couple of decades out of date, that was all.
But you defend it?
No, I've just said to you, it's a couple of decades out of date. That is how you and I would have spoken just after we left school. That was the language of the day. The language of the day, you know what I mean. The language of the day was different. Language evolves, it moves on.
Now, what about what's going on here? I mean, from the point of view of the Brexit Party, best thing could happen for you would be no deal all round, wouldn't it?
Well, the best thing for us would be to have Brexit. And Brexit means leaving the single market, leaving the customs union, leaving the jurisdiction of the ECJ, and ultimately having a sensible trade agreement with our friends in Europe. That's what we've always wanted. You know, happy with reciprocity, happy with fair exchange, but not to be part of the political institutions. And here's the problem. That, OK, the backstop gets replaced with something else, but from the DUP's perspective, it may feel as bad, if perhaps not even worse, than the backstop. But on everything else, in terms of where we go, let's just say, for argument's sake, this got agreed. Would it end the problems of this great Brexit debate? No, arguably, we've just done the easy bit. The hard bit would be what comes over the course of the next 2 or 3 years, because we're going to be half in, half out, in this never-never land. And the real problem is this. To get to any sort of free trade deal with the EU, already the French and Spanish are saying, oh, well, fishing, you can't have your territorial fishing borders back. It would appear, we don't know.
But against that, I mean, it is true our fishermen mainly sell their stuff into the European Union.
Because there's an insatiable demand in places like Southern Spain.
But therefore there does have to be some give and take, doesn't there?
No, because there is a big difference between buying and selling goods and actually having management and control of what should be yours. Similarly, with regulatory alignment. I mean, if we finish up in a negotiation for the next 2, 3, 4 years about regulatory alignment where they won't give an inch, about building on the existing customs partnership, many of us would say, what's the point of leaving?
But against that, do you want Britain to have worse standards in workers' rights, worse standards
in a democracy,
on the environment?
No. This is where the argument goes wrong. In a democracy, you should debate at general elections employment legislation, environmental legislation. I think we're perfectly capable of doing it far better than it's done at an EU level.
Well, maybe capable of it, but should we do it? Because if we're going to be in direct competition with the European Union, undercutting them in that area might be a good thing.
Well, that's called competition. It's called being efficient. It's the one thing the EU are terrified of. Angela Merkel last week...
Yeah, but what I'm saying is, do you back that? Because do you back Singapore on the Thames?
If we're not making our own laws across the whole range of issues We're not an independent country. That's what Brexit's about. It's about us being an independent country.
Yeah, but there's also a question about what sort of independent country, isn't there? Is it a high environmental standards, high worker rights?
We will decide that. We will actually have general elections where we start debating this sort of stuff again, which we haven't done for the last 30 years, because all of those rules have been made here in the EU.
And at that point, if we get there, if we get that independence, what's the point of the Brexit Party?
Well, we will have achieved a great historic victory. What's wrong with that? And we'll go on campaigning.
Well, will you go on? That's the question.
Political reform. There are many other things that we're talking about that people really want to see post-Brexit. But look, we're dealing here with the biggest political crisis, you know, arguably for a couple of 100 years. And we want to get this delivered. And if Boris Johnson comes back with just a slight amendment to Mrs May's dreadful EU treaty, and that's what it is, then I think you'll find support for the Brexit Party rising very sharply, very quickly.
So let's be clear. If Boris Johnson does what he's setting out to do, he gets an agreement and he gets Parliament to endorse it, both pretty big ifs.
Yeah, sure.
You're saying you won't back off, that the Brexit Party will run against the Conservative Party?
No, because we're going to be stuck in this never-never land for years to come. It's the worst of all worlds. The worst of all worlds. And if Parliament...
So he won't have put you back in the box, as he said he would?
No, I know, he keeps trying. And the worst of all worlds would be, what if a referendum amendment passed on, and I say, let's not call it a deal, let's call it what it is, an EU treaty. But if we had this passed on Saturday with a referendum amendment, I mean, that would be our democracy simply traduced.
Well, all right, what do you do? Just suppose we do get to a referendum and the choice is the deal, which you don't like, or remaining, which you think is even worse. What are you going to do?
If the choice is the existing EU treaties or a new EU treaty, I will stay at home. I won't
stay at home, and you'd say to your supporters,
I won't vote, I won't campaign, I'll have nothing to do with it whatsoever. You cannot. I mean, even to have another referendum is wrong. To have one and not put a credible leave option on the ballot paper would be a democratic outrage.
But it might be binding.
Well, the last one wasn't binding, so why should the next one be binding?
All this situation you've got us into, we might end up remaining after all that, having wasted all this time and energy.
You know, I want us perfectly clear. Every leading player on the Leave and Remain side said a Leave vote means leaving the single market and leaving the customs union, leaving regulatory alignment, being in charge ourselves of this legislation, and that's what needs to be delivered.
And you're saying this deal isn't that?
Absolutely not.
And as far as yourself, I'm just trying to work this out. So we come to this election, you're running against the Conservatives. Boris Johnson will be saying, presumably, I've taken us out. I mean, you don't stand much of a chance, do you?
Well, I tell you what. I don't think whatever's agreed tonight is going to pass on Saturday anyway. So I think that may be an academic discussion. But let me put this to you. If Withdrawal Agreement 4 fails on Saturday, as I believe it will, I think then Boris Johnson as Prime Minister will drop the idea of this new treaty, and there is the possibility of putting together a Leave alliance for the next general election, and all the numbers and all the polls show...
You're saying if he doesn't get a deal, it doesn't get through, that's the moment when Brexit and the Conservatives can start working together?
I think there is an opportunity here for a Brexit alliance to fight the election that would win a big majority in Parliament. So, look, you know, I would much rather we had an extension and a chance of a general election than accept this dreadful new EU treaty. Absolutely.
So that's the offer to Boris Johnson, go for no deal and we can talk Turkey.
I think in a general election manifesto, you know, he could even talk about going for a genuine free trade agreement. I think getting rid of Mr. Barnier's treaty is the really important thing.
Because, I mean, as things stand, if there is an agreement and you run, all you will do is help the Remain parties, won't you?
Well, Adam, with respect, you said that to me in 2015. You said that standing 640-odd UKIP candidates would split the Conservative vote. And in fact, we hurt the Labour vote in UKIP all those years ago, much more in that election than we hurt the Conservatives. And now that Labour have gone for a full-on second referendum policy, there are nearly 5 million Labour voters that voted Leave. So difficult to predict what the effect of the Brexit Party would be in those circumstances.